Hey folks, Scott Walters here. Welcome back to the Bulletproof Garage for episode 15 of Project Brutus. In this episode, we are working on the valve train for that 7.3 IDI turbo diesel build. We're going to be checking a lot of things in this episode, all right? We're going to be determining valve to valve guide clearance, all right? We're also going to be checking valve spring pressure, and we're going to be measuring valve recession, okay? These are things that your machine shop normally does, but we're going to do it here in our garage or in our little workspace right here, right outside the garage, with some fairly inexpensive and easy to use tools, all right? So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Here in the Bulletproof Garage.
Okay folks, let's talk about how to check the health of your valve guides without using calipers or a mic, all right? It's very simple. I've got a clean and dry exhaust valve. This is a number 5 valve, all right? And it has to be free of oil as well, all right? So I've degreased it. Now the valve guide is the same. It's cleaned, it's been degreased, all right? So you go ahead and insert the valve in the guide, and then you can see right here, I'm just going to press the valve down, and I'm going to keep my finger on top of the top of the valve guide. And when I pull it out and I hear a pop, probably in pretty good shape, okay? So if your valve guide is hogged out, or as we say back home, wallered out, you're not going to hear that pop, okay? Okay folks, now we're going to do the wiggle test. The wiggle test is very simple, all right? Again, clean and dry valve going in a clean and dry valve guide. No oil in there whatsoever, all right? So I'm going to open up the valve at about 1/2 inch, which is the distance it's going to be on most engines when your valves are open, all right? And at that point, I'm just going to wiggle it, all right? And there is a detectable amount of wiggle, all right? It's hard for you to see, but it is slightly wiggling. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some light oil on the valve, okay? All right, now that I've got oil on the valve, I'm going to put it back in the same guide, and lo and behold, the wiggle is gone, all right? So remember, the clearance between the valve and the valve guide is about 2/1000ths of an inch, all right? Give or take 1/1000th on a decent valve guide, on one that's good. And that oil will take up that distance, all right? That oil will fill up 1/1000th to 3/1000th, all right? So if your valve guides are bad, you're going to put some oil on there, and you're still going to have some wiggle. Fair enough?
Okay folks, I have checked out all the valves, specifically the valve stems, and I have some concerns. Let's talk about the process. So what I've got here is the number 2 exhaust valve for the 1994 turbo engine, all right? And I am measuring the valve stems. Now you can have a variance in the stem of 1/1000th, all right? If they are outside of that variance, you're going to need to get new valves. So the process: shot a brake cleaner on a paper towel, wipe the valve stem down. You want to make sure that you're measuring valve stem and not carbon. All right, now I have a micrometer here. This is a digital micrometer. I got it on Amazon for 40 bucks. It works well. It has pretty good ratings, and I'm going to use that to measure the valve stem in 3 different areas. Now, the first area that you want to measure is the top of the valve stem where it is not riding inside the valve. So that is this area right here, all right? And you should see, there's usually a shiny area or a dull area that indicates the change from where it is riding inside the valve guide and where it's not riding inside the valve guide, all right? So that's the first measurement right here. Then I'm going to measure again about 1/3 of the way down the valve, and then I'm going to measure again near the bottom of the valve where it is still riding within the valve guide. All right, again, you see there's a pretty sharp demarcation here between, this area of the valve is not riding in the valve stem, in the valve guide, and this area is riding in the valve guide. All right, now I've already recorded what I got, but let's just check it again. All right. All right, first measurement, 0.38695. All right, next measurement, 0.38685, and then the last measurement, 0.3863. All right, so it's obvious the valve itself has had some wear, right? Because the measurements, it's getting smaller as we move down to the end of the valve. And you can actually see this where it's worn. All right, so let me show you. All right, that valve should not be worn like that. I can feel the roughness with my fingernail here. All right, and so that's not good, folks. Now, the good news is that all the valves checked out to be within spec. They're all within 1,000th variance on both the 88 and the 94 motor, but I'm worried about this valve. Even though the valve itself is within spec, I don't like that wear. I suspect when we check the valve guides, which we're going to do next, we're going to find out that the guides are a little tight. And why is that? Well, these valve stems are 15 thousandths oversized, all right? So this is an engine that's been rebuilt. When it was rebuilt, somebody reamed out the valve guides, and when they did so, they reamed them out, presumably 15 thousandths, and when they did so, in order to account for that, they sourced valves with a thicker valve stem. So I suspect that they should have reamed them out just another extra thousandth or so, because I think when we check the valve guides on the 94 engine, we're going to realize that the valve guides are just a little tight, all right? And hopefully we can hone those out or something along those lines, all right? Okay, folks, now we're going to use what's called a split ball gauge or a small hole gauge to measure the inside diameter of the valve guides, all right? So this has got a thumb screw right here, and as you tighten the thumb screw, you can see that the split ball spreads apart. Obviously, that's where you get your adjustability. We're working on the 1994 cylinder heads here, all right? That's for the turbo motor, and we're working on the intake valve for the number 2 cylinder. So you just slide it in, and what you're looking for is just a slight amount of friction as it slides through, all right? And I'm going to measure this in 3 places, but this one is going to have the same measurement all the way through, all right? So what you do at this point is you pull out your micrometer, and you go ahead and get your measurement. All right, 0.3883 is what I'm getting. 3883, okay? Number 2 intake.
All right, I have finished checking the valve stem to valve guide clearance on the 88 heads and on the 94 heads. All right, I'm sure most of y'all hate math as much as I do, but there's a method to the madness, okay? So what I did is basically I averaged the valve stem size and I averaged the valve guide size, all right? And then I subtracted the average valve stem size from the average valve guide size, and I got a number, all right? And that number is my valve stem to valve guide clearance. And on the 1988 heads, all was well, all right? the tightest clearance I had was 0.0018, all right, or 18 10,000ths. The loosest clearance I found was 0.0027 or 27 10,000ths. Now, Ford will tell you that the loosest you can go before they need to be replaced or reamed out and oversized valves installed is 55 10,000. So we're in good shape. And also, given the specs of these from the factory, they leave the factory with around 21 10,000ths of clearance, so 0.0021. So we are all in the ballpark. All right. So these heads valve guides are good. That's the 88 naturally aspirated 7.3. That's the low mile engine. All right, and that's where the good news stops. Because the 94, the IDI turbo engine, has got problems. Now remember, the 94 engine has been rebuilt, and valves with oversized stems were installed after the valve guides were reamed out. Folks, I don't think whoever was in charge of reaming those valve guides out did a really good job, because the clearances are not great. The tightest clearances, I've got three valves at 5 10,000. So that's 0.0005, all right, when they should be about 4 times that. All right, so those are too dadgum tight. The loosest one I have is at 0.0025. So the 0.0025 or 25 10,000ths is within spec, but 0.0005 or 5 10,000ths is absolutely not in spec. And we are not going to run this engine with valves at that clearance, all right? So we're going to have to either ream those out or hone those out until we've got the clearance. And frankly, I think we're going to replace the valves as well, at least the exhaust valves, because they all showed some signs of wear.
All right, before we go any further, let's talk about the limitations of our test equipment, all right? And first I need to explain to you what we've got here, all right? So your rocker arms are going to sit on top of these pedestals, right? And they're pushing down on the valves that ride inside these valve guides. So your rocker arm is going to be moving in this axis or this plane of motion, all right? Pushing down on the valve. And it's exerting forces on the valve in this axis, right? So the valve guide is going to wear here and it's going to wear there. It's not going to have nearly as much wear here, all right? So when you wiggle your valve that's sitting in the valve guide, all right, you should feel more movement on a worn valve guide when you're wiggling up and down than you would side to side. And that's because the valve guide wears in that axis, all right? So they're oblong. And what does that mean? Why is that impacting how we can measure? Let me show you. So I had the graphics department at the Bulletproof Garage draw up this expert sketch, okay? So if your valve guide here and here is wearing oblong, when you put the split ball gauge in the valve guide, you're really just going to be measuring this distance here to here, right? Because your valve guide is not completely round, all right, but your split ball gauge is round or close to round until you expand it, all right? And so you're not going to really measure this distance to this distance. So you're going to get an imperfect measurement, all right? Now, if you've got a snap gauge, which I'll show you here in a second, a snap gauge is potentially going to give you a better measurement inside an oblong valve guide because it can account for this, all right? So let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, so this is the split ball gauge that we've been using, right? You tighten down the thumb screw and it expands the ball and you're able to take a measurement. But again, since this is round, you're not necessarily going to get a true measurement of an oblong valve guide. On the snap gauge, the way a snap gauge works is similar. You have a thumb screw at the bottom and you compress the end of the gauge, all right? These are spring loaded, and then you release it, all right? And when those pop out, then that's going to allow you to measure. Let's say you're measuring the valve guide top to bottom, all right? That's going to have a better chance of giving you an accurate measurement, all right? And so basically what you do is you insert it into the valve guide and it's going to compress, and when it compresses, you're going to go ahead and tighten down the thumb screw, all right? And then once you've got the thumb screw tightened, then you can take your mic, much like we did with the split ball gauge, and measure that distance. Now, let me tell you what I did is I actually went back and checked some additional valve guides after I've already checked them with the split ball gauge, and I checked them with the snap gauge, and some of them were dead on, all right? And some were off by, say, a 10,000th or 2 or 3, okay? So that is 0.0001, 0.0002, and so on, okay? So it's a very small measurement, and for our purposes, you know, we've got good enough for government work. But at the end of the day, I still think a snap gauge is going to give you a better measurement of an oblong valve guide, one that has had some wear. For a valve guide that hadn't seen a lot of wear, either one's going to be fine, you know, the split ball or the snap gauge, all right?
Okay, time to test the valve springs. Valve springs do wear out over time. They do not maintain their pressure indefinitely, so it's a good idea to check them when you're rebuilding or refreshing your engine, all right? So I have a valve spring pressure tester right here. I'll post up the specs on cost and where you can buy it. And it's very simple. So you're just going to set the valve spring here on the tester, and you're going to place it in your vise and tighten your vise down. So the test pressure on this spring, according to Ford, is going to be 200 PSI. And that is give or take 8 PSI, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and get it to 200. And I'm going to go ahead and take a measurement here and see what my length is. The length, the test length, is 1.397 inches. Okay, I'm at 1.398 inches, and 1/100th is not going to make a difference. And as you can see, I am right at 202 PSI. So this valve spring is within spec, and it's good to go. Now I just need to do that 15 more times.
Okay, now we're going to measure valve recession. So as you know, as this valve pounds up and down into the valve seat over time, the valve is going to wear out and the seat is going to wear out, all right? And so measuring valve recession is how we determine whether that is out of spec or not. So it's very simple. You just place the appropriate valve in the appropriate valve guide, and you need a tool like this guy here, all right? So this is a dial indicator holder. I'll post up the specs and the price here. And what you want to do is you want to get, I like to do it like this. I like to put my dial indicator on the actual valve and then zero it out, all right? Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so got my dial indicator zeroed out right here, and then I'm just going to move it off of the valve onto the cylinder head, all right, and it's going to give me a measurement, all right? It's going to give me a measurement of 51 thousandths, all right? And Ford has given you the specs on this engine, and so they say your intake valve recession spec is between 42 thousandths and 54 thousandths, so this one is good to go. On the exhaust, it's a little different. The exhaust is 51 thousandths to 63 thousandths, all right? So again, this valve is within spec, and of course I just need to check this 15 more times to make sure both of these heads are good to go. So let's talk about where we are with these cylinder heads, right? We got a lot of good news, okay? We got good news on the valve springs. We got good news on the valve recession. Let's talk about the 94 heads. There were no cracks in the castings. Yeah, the pre-cups were cracked, and that's something I still haven't figured out, right? There's not a real good OEM source out there for pre-cups. The stuff that's out there on the market is not OEM quality, and I'm hesitant to use those, all right? So I may end up running these as is with the cracked pre-cups. I may harvest the pre-cups off the 88 heads. I don't know, all right? Now, what about the valve guides on the 94 heads? Well, remember these heads had been rebuilt. Valves with oversized stems, they were 15 thousandths oversized, right, were installed, and the valve guides were reamed out to accept the oversized valves. But they weren't reamed out enough because some of the valve guides had way too little clearance, and some of the valves were galled, all right? So, frankly, I am not set up to resize valve guides here. I wish I was, but I'm just not. The tooling is actually fairly expensive, and it's not something simple like getting the appropriate size drill bit and just running it through there and calling it good. It just doesn't work like that, all right? So these need to go to the machine shop to get the valve guides honed out for the correct clearance. And I'm thinking 2 thousandths on the intake and 3 thousandths on the exhaust, all right? So the 94 heads are going to the machine shop. Now, what about the 88 heads? Well, remember, they were, man, they were beautiful until I found that crack, all right? And so, you know, is that cylinder head junk? I think it is, but you know what? I may get a clean bill of health from the machine shop. So I'm curious to hear what they see, what they find, and what they think about that cylinder head, whether that crack can be repaired easily, all right, or whether I can run them as is. They can do things like a pressure test to see if the heads will hold pressure or not. So more to follow on that. So that's where we are. Both sets of heads are going to the machine shop, and obviously once I figure out what the way ahead is from there, I'll let you know. Hey folks, that is it for this episode. I hope you found it enjoyable and informative. And if so, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button as well. Now, in between episodes, you can also find me on social media. I'm on Instagram at the.bulletproof.garage, and you can also find me on Facebook at The Bulletproof Garage. Again, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time on The Bulletproof Garage.